Hello and welcome to Game Design Hour. I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and each episode I sit down with the people who create the video games you know and love. On today's episode, I sat down with Rodrigo Monteiro about his work on the video game Wargroove. Wargroove is a turn-based war combat game where you battle your way through different levels in the campaign mode. Let's get into the interview. What was the first thing that really sparked your interest in creating video games?
So I guess back as a kid, I was already really into video games. So this would be in the early 90s. My dad had an Atari 2600. I had a Master System, and then I had a SNES. And I played those a lot. But what I do remember is that back then, certainly as far back as when I played A Link to the Past, so early 90s, I did already know I wanted to make video games. And so what I would do is I would get pieces of paper and design games on them and make paper cutouts. So I play Link to the Past. So I was like, okay, let me make this giant dungeon made of several pieces of paper and then cut out little monsters and characters and enact my own game. And then when I was around 11 or 12, I was fortunate enough to get access to some software to start getting my hands on making games. And so for the past 26 years, I've been making them.
So with that software, how did you first learn how to create the video games?
Right. So the software in case was called Click and Play. And Click and Play is the descendant, is the ancestor of Multimedia Fusion. I don't know if Multimedia Fusion is still really around, but it also led to Cirrus Construct, I believe is based off that. So my friend bought a copy of Click and Play, and it actually came with a really substantial manual teaching a lot of stuff. It had some built-in games that you could explore how they were made. All extremely simple, of course. But I just kind of went really deep into it. And I was like, I really wanted to make games. And even if they were the most basic, simple, really bad games one can imagine, it was really fun making them. And I just kind of had to teach myself. There was no YouTube back then. I was too young to even go to uni. Even if I was of that age, there were no real game development courses in Brazil. I'm from Brazil. So I just had to figure out by inspecting how other games worked and reading whatever material I could get my hands on.
How did you first get into the industry after learning how to create games?
So this would have been 2008. At that point, I had already made quite a few really small, mostly game jam games with friends. I participate in a few the Allegro Speed Hack game jams well before Global Game Jam and stuff. Then in 2008, I saw an email in the uni newsletter of a local company looking for video game programmers. And I was like, I can do that. So I applied to them. And it was a local company that it was an online community of card-based games, mostly card games, but also traditional board games like chess or checkers. So I joined them, started making games in Java. So I applied, they hired me. Next week I started, I think. And I spent some good 4 years there. Eventually helped them develop other kinds of games that weren't just card games. So we made a few things that were a little bit more traditional game-like. Couldn't go too far because the target audience was still very much older people who were there more for the community and just have the games as an excuse to socialize. But yeah, that was my first job. And then whilst there, I, at some point, got a job offer from a company in the UK. So I moved to the UK and have been here since.
Well, working on those first few professional games, what lessons did you learn that you've now taken with you onto the games you're currently working on?
So it's a really interesting one. I think working on a team is always very different than working with yourself, especially when it's a live service. If you break something, you have this huge community of people who now can't access the product they paid for. So I guess it taught me a lot in terms of collaborating with the team, but also collaborating with them in a way to ensure the stability of the software and everything. So I guess that's where I learned how to use source control. We used Subversion back then. Did we ever move to Git there? I don't think we did. So it was Subversion. And yeah, lots of lessons of just how to properly test the game and make sure that when it goes live, it will work. How to make sure that my code is good, not just for myself, but also for everyone else I'm working with. Just because I know what I'm making there doesn't mean it's obvious for everyone else. So I guess a lot of lessons around those things.
How did you first think of the idea for Wargroove?
So I wasn't there when Wargroove was first concepted, but I do know the story. After Starbound 1.0 came out, some of the staff continued work on Starbound, but then other parts of the company were like, okay, let's start working on our next big thing. So there was an internal ideas jam, and different people in the company came up and developed their own game pitches. And then they were all pitched amongst the company, and everybody had a vote on what they thought was cool. And in the end, there were two runaway winners, which were Witchbrook and Wargroove. Witchbrook back then was still called Spellbound. And the idea of Wargroove was to be a lightweight tactical game, very much in the spirit of games like Advance Wars or Shining Force or Tactics Ogre, but with very cute graphics. It was supposed to be a fairly small game, very accessible, and they started working on it. And then I joined soon after as the programmer for the project.
What game engine was used to create Wargroove, and what did you like and dislike about using that game engine?
Well, it's an interesting question because Wargroove is developed with Hali, which is my own game engine, Hali. It was when I joined Chucklefish and they were looking for a person to implement this. I was leaving a job that used Unity, and Unity is all right, but I did have a few gripes with it. And for years, I had been working on developing this engine designed specifically for 2D games. And I showed them lots of the small game jam games I had made in this engine. And I told them, look, we can make it in Unity. We can make it in my engine. There are pros and cons. And they ultimately trusted me to make the right decision. And I decided to use my engine. So I guess in terms of what I like and what I don't like, I do like everything in it because I designed it to work the way I want it to be. Although there are shortfalls in terms of I don't have all of the manpower of a big engine like Unity or Unreal or even GameMaker. So my tooling, especially at the time, was much more modest. But it grew with the game, and the engine kind of ended up shaping itself to better serve the needs of Wargroove. So in the end, it was a really positive experience, but certainly not a very usual path for an indie game these days, I don't think.
Pretty much every game has ideas that have been cut for one reason or another. Were there any interesting ideas that were talked about at Wargroove that you liked but just ended up getting cut?
Oh, there are a lot. Some of them in the interest of the game needs to have some scope and needs to be finished. Others because it wouldn't necessarily have worked with the design we went with. For example, at some point we wanted the different factions to have very different passive stat modifiers. So maybe Cherrystone units would have better defense, maybe Felheim units would have more offense, or I don't know exactly. But we ended up not doing that because it would have made the game very difficult to balance, basically. And one of our concerns was we wanted the game to be really fun to play as a competitive game, and a lot of considerations had to be made to not completely break everything there. There were a few game modes that we considered, like maybe for the main campaign, you could have we thought of a real-time mode where you are advancing on different troops, but we felt ultimately this is supposed to be a simple, accessible strategy game. So a straightforward, more or less linear with a few branching paths campaign made more sense.
Managing scope is a really important aspect of creating games. How did you work to manage the scope of Wargroove while you were working on it? And how did it change from the first sort of idea to what you have now?
The original idea of Wargroove was to make it a really small game. In its initial concept, it would not have had the map and campaign editors, wouldn't have had multiplayer even. But as we started prototyping the game, we started with the goal, okay, let's get the basic battle system implemented. Let's see what the game feels like. And then we can evaluate whether we're happy with the scope or if we need to expand. And as we developed the game, Finn is our creative director. He would often talk about how it's important for the game to feel like a satisfying package. And that means not just giving the basics of the minimum required for that kind of game, but it's important to have additional modes and additional extras and things like that. So we started talking about things like the level editors. So it's well, it would be really cool if you could make your own maps. And once you have that, we would think, well, it would also be great if you could share those maps with your friends and with the community online. But also, well, instead of just making maps, it would be really cool if you could program the maps and have missions and campaigns. So a lot of the scope creep came from the content creation side. It did, I think, really pay off because it also allowed us to have this really powerful tool that we were going to ship to users. But then we could also use it ourselves to make the campaign. So everything you play in Wargroove, all of the campaign levels were made with the mission editor that ships with the game. So any user has the power to make something equally as sophisticated. We are in a lucky position to be a self-funded company. So we could afford to basically increase the scope of the project for the sake of making it a better product. We didn't have external deadlines or anything like that. So it did increase a lot in complexity. The 1-year project ended up taking 2.5 years. I think the extra time was well worth it.
So the same level editor that players can use in the level editor area is what you use to create all of the levels?
Yeah, that's correct. Everything in Wargroove was made in that editor that ships with the game.
Did you always plan to tell a story using the game? And how did the story evolve throughout the creation of the game?
So I think the very first idea would be what eventually became the arcade mode of the game, is that you would pick a commander and then you'd play through a short campaign where you'd go through a few different enemies, depending on which commander you chose, and have a little lightweight story. And then you'd have those 12 plus campaigns, mini campaigns to play. And we did eventually do that. It's the arcade mode, actually really fun, I think. But as the game became bigger and more sophisticated, we felt, well, we have these cool characters. It would be really cool to have this overall bigger narrative. So the whole team sat together. We brainstormed the general structure of the campaign. And then over the course of many months, it was a lot of work between Finn, the creative designer, and Steven, who was the lead designer, and Abby, who was the writer, and Lily and Doris, and everybody like working on creating the content. And we had the basic structure plan, but as we worked on it, everybody was fitting ideas and the story evolved and became more and more detailed.
What was your process for designing and creating each of the different missions?
So there's a few things we wanted to make sure. One, we wanted you to be able to play with every single one of the main 12 commanders throughout the campaign, including the antagonistic one. So we had a few missions that then goes like, okay, what would make sense for this person to be fighting this person? But also we wanted to have a good mix of missions which were like simple, basic gameplay, which is you capture villages, generate income, train units, defeat the enemy. But also some missions which are more RPG-like. It's like, okay, you have a small party and you have to make use of your limited resources to go across. Or, okay, we want to have a mission to teach you about air units. Or another mission which is all about naval combat. Or a mission where trebuchets and fog of war are really important. So I guess we establish what's the central theme of each mission, what are the interesting things that you can do in Wargroove that we wanted to showcase in the campaign, and made and found a way to arrange this jigsaw puzzle and figure out what the full campaign was.
So the default difficulty mode of the game is hard. Can you tell me a bit about that decision to set that as the default?
Yeah, so that's actually really interesting. When Wargroove shipped, so that was the 1st of February 2019, we immediately started getting a lot of feedback, and we immediately started collecting the feedback and acting upon it. We thought it was really important for the community to address their major concerns in a first patch relatively quickly. So when we shipped the game, it did not have a difficulty select mode. It was just the one difficulty of the game. And a lot of players, rightfully so, thought the game was very hard. Wargroove is fairly challenging. So we thought, okay, we need to add difficulty select, but we didn't feel it was fair to call the normal difficulty normal and then a more accessible one easy, considering how difficult the game was for most players who didn't have a lot of experience in this genre. So we decided, okay, we'll default the game to hard, and then we'll have 2 or 3 difficulties below it, and maybe 1 above. I can't remember now how many there were. But it was basically that we felt, okay, we can have a normal difficulty, which is slightly easier than the standard, and but it will still default to what the game was originally made. Yeah, that was the compromise.
How did you go about playtesting for Wargroove, and what about the playtesting process that you used here will you be taking with you into any future games you work on?
So we did a lot of in-house playtesting. So some people in the studio were very keen on strategy games, played a lot. So every time Steven would make a new level, other people would play the level and give their feedback. Perhaps we got too good at the game, considering what the default difficulty was. But you would often have Finn wanting to play other people in the studio to get a sense of where the game balance was. So the Advanced Wars community, and back then, they had this web client called Advanced Wars by Web, or AWBW. And they still play kind of like a modified version of Advanced Wars online, and it's like a PvP thing. And we got a lot of people from that community who seemed interested in Wargroove, and we invited them over to a closed beta and have them play the game versus each other and find out if there's any significant balancing issues. And there were a lot of changes. We did ship with a few balance issues probably. And in that same month one patch that we introduced difficult levels, we also rebalanced some units, in particular the Spearmen. I think they were fixed in the first patch. The Spearmen were very powerful at first. A lot of players basically got through the game just using Spearmen, which is not fun. So we rebalanced a lot of units. And then there was another balance pass when we got to Double Trouble, the free DLC, as it introduced new units, and we took it as an opportunity to overhaul some of the balance of the game. And I think it got to a really good place. But playtesting with community members was really useful. And in terms of taking it forward, I think absolutely, if we ever make another game, a strategy game or a game that requires PvP or competitive balance, playtesting with players who are experienced in the genre, I think is very valuable.
So the characters of the game do have some voice acted lines, but not every single line is done by a voice actor. Most lines just have a word or a sound that goes along with the text. Can you tell me a bit about the decision to do the voice acting in that way?
A lot of the reason for that was for the aesthetic of it, really. A lot of games in the early 32-bit era, so PlayStation 1 or Sega Saturn, would have this, where they have a start of a voice as if to hint on the voice of the character, but they wouldn't do the full voice acting. And we really wanted to capture the feel of that. It also helped in terms of writing the game, because it meant that we didn't have to have the final script of the game ready before we could start recording sessions, which was very helpful because writing ended up being finalized relatively late in the lifetime of the project. So we had lines that we had decided that would establish the baseline personality of each commander, and a few fun lines that we put like little references, and we just got the actors to record those more or less out of context, and we picked and inserted them as a little bit of flavor. But ultimately, it didn't feel right to us for a game of that aesthetic to have full-on voice acting.
How large was the team that created the game?
For a while, it was just me and an artist. And then soon after, the creative director and another artist joined. Then soon after, the level designer. So for a while, for maybe a year, it was 5 people. After that, it increased slowly, 6, 7. And then for the last year of development, we had maybe 11, 12 people.
Which parts of Wargroove did you have to put the most time and effort into to get just the way you wanted it?
I can definitely speak from a technical point of view that the UI of the game was a lot of work. And there's a lot of things about the UI of Wargroove that made it a challenging project. One, because we need to, it's pixel art, so we can't freely scale it. It supports 11 different languages, so it had to work with long words in German and with very information-dense characters in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. And it had to work on different resolutions. So, for example, the standard resolution of the game is 640 by 360, which is scale up. But when you're playing on the Switch in handheld mode, for example, we use a smaller crop. You can toggle it in the options, but by default, we use a smaller crop of 427 by 240 because it makes the game feel more native. It feels like a nice handheld retro game. And because of that, all of the UI had to work on a range of resolutions from 427 by 240 to 640 by 360. And on PC, who knows? Because on PC, anything goes. So all of the UI had to be made considering both of those. And in addition to all of that, on PC, we support gamepad and mouse with seamless transitions between them. So all of the UI has to support 11 languages, pixel art, multiple resolutions, dual control scheme, and everything has to work. And there's a lot of UI, especially because the map and campaign editor have a lot of sophisticated UI, so you can set up the actions and the cutscenes and everything. So that took a long time. UI work is often underappreciated for how difficult it can be. That was probably a year of my time working around UI.
Were there any interesting encounters or mission ideas that you liked but just ended up getting cut for some reason?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think there were a few ideas we had left over at the end of Wargroove, but then with Double Trouble, we had the opportunity of making a second campaign. The second one was focused on co-op play, and I think that was a good place for us to use any of those outstanding ideas. We did also have some post-release support in terms of releasing a few semi-official maps through the in-game user-generated content browser. So Steven made a few maps. I feel like he made a Dota-like map at some point. Maps that were like different rule sets, and that was the right place for those. So I think we had plenty of opportunity to ship any cool ideas we had.
Are there any Easter eggs that you added into the game that you haven't really seen many players find yet?
No, quite on the contrary. We had a very elaborate quest to unlock a secret character in the game, and it involves you playing through the campaign and doing certain things in certain missions in a certain order. And we thought it would take the players a while. In the first week, they knew exactly the whole procedure. They worked it out by themselves. It was really fun watching them do it, but I maybe I thought it would take them a little bit longer.
What was the biggest challenge that you faced while working on Wargroove?
I don't know. I think there is definitely a high bar for games of this genre. And there has been a lot of very good games, like Advance Wars. And there's been other games that were good, but did not get a very warm reception. And I think Wargroove was always at risk of not living up to the high standards of the players of this genre. But I think it did. And the critic reception was really positive, and the player reception was really positive. So I'm very glad that we've managed that. But I think that it was always a thing that it was like, well, if we get anything wrong here, the players might just not like this game.
Can fans of the game expect any more content in the future?
So we have said that we do have future plans for more Groove, but the details of that, the fans will have to wait and see.
Looking back now, what do you wish you could have done differently before the initial launch of the game?
I think the difficulty balance of the main campaign could have been a smoother curve. There's especially a couple of very difficult missions relatively early on. I think Act 3, Mission 3 is a showstopper for a lot of players. So I wish we had made that a little bit easier just to get more players to enjoy more of it. Perhaps also unlocking the other modes, the arcade and puzzle modes a bit earlier, because those are really fun, but some players got stuck in a campaign and didn't get to unlock those. Those are just my personal opinions. I don't know if the rest of the Wargroove team would necessarily share those, but I think those were the things that, like, in hindsight, maybe that could have been a little bit different. But I think overall, we're really happy with the game we shipped.
What was the biggest lesson that you learned while working on Wargroove?
A lot of lessons, but I think UI is hard. UI is hard was a big lesson. I think we had quite a few lessons around localization. We partnered with a company called Schlock, they were really good. They were amazing. But I feel like in hindsight, I wish I had prepared better tooling to give them access to the localization. It worked out well, but it was perhaps a bit more difficult than it needed to be. We were basically giving them giant Google Sheets with all the strings in the game, and they had to copy paste, and it wasn't great. I mean, they never complained. they worked with it, but it was quite difficult sometimes on our end to like make sure everything was in sync. So maybe a lesson there to make that better for next time.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to a newer game dev trying to go and make their first game?
I think they should go and make their first game. I think, realistically speaking, most people's first games are not going to be great, but the lessons you will learn will be absolutely invaluable. I've made so many horrible games in my life, but every time I learned something new and it just helped me iterate. I think we are very fortunate to be in a time when game engines are very accessible and tutorials to those engines are very accessible. So a lot of people worry about, oh, should I go do Unity or Unreal? I don't think it really matters. I think you should just pick something and start making a game, because the really important lessons are universal. And no matter what game you make on what engine, you are still going to learn so much and it's going to be worth it.
What's next for you? What are you working on now?
So currently we're working on Witchbrook and I'm the lead programmer on that. So yeah, working on that. It's an amazingly fun project to work on, and I can't wait for people to be able to see more of it and play it.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great interviewing you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
And that's the interview. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to it. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give us a follow so that you don't miss out on the next episode. Also, consider leaving us a rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you have a friend who you think may enjoy the show, make sure to share it with them. If you want to stay up to date with what's going on with the podcast, make sure to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, or Twitter at Game Design Hour. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.